Kyle Pitts has tremendous growth potential to be productive in 2024. We'll break down how that will be fueled by his changing role in Zac Robinson's new look Falcons offense and where exactly the upgrade at quarterback impacts most.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. So, guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Falcons for an entire lifetime, right? A generation since 2006, formerly at FalcFans.com. RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. You may also know me as Sirius Black, as Mr. Drew, as the Jolly Green Giant, as the iron that sharpens the iron, or you just may know me as Mr. AKA. And of course, I appreciate each and every one of you that knows me, whether you call me by my aliases or you just know me as that guy on the internet that's always talking trash about the Atlanta Falcons. I appreciate each and every one of you, regardless of how you feel about me, because why do I appreciate you? Oh, because you happen to make this illustrious podcast, whether you love or like the host or hate the host, you know, your first listen each and every day, and to become an everydayer of this podcast, all you got to do is subscribe and follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode is going to be all about Kyle Pitts, right? Yesterday, we talked a lot about Drake London being kind of the breadwinner in this offense, and sort of how motion would potentially elevate players like Darnell Mooney and Rondell Moore. So go check out that episode if you're more into that. But today we're talking mostly about Kyle Pitts and sort of what we can expect out of this new look offense under Zac Robinson with Kirk Cousins at the helm on today's episode. And we've talked about some of these things at various points throughout this offseason, back in January, back in March, sprinkled in. I think we had one episode in April or May as well. But, you know, let's talk about it again, right? Which is the expectation that we're going to see Kyle Pitts. Probably the biggest change in terms of his usage in Zac Robinson's offense is the expectation that he'll be utilized more on short passes than he has in the past. Now, Arthur Smith did it differently than most teams do it in the NFL when it came to Kyle Pitts being his primary vertical stretch, receiver in this offense. And typically how you see it in the NFL is tight ends tend to be the underneath targets while the wide receivers are the vertical stretch guys, and the Falcons did it backwards. And again, that's a testament to Kyle Pitts' status as a unicorn, that he's the rare type of talent that could theoretically be that player. But it didn't lead to a lot of production. We'll get into all that as this episode explores. But only about 45% of Kyle Pitts' career targets have traveled less than 10 yards in the air. So the short stuff, right? And then you compare that to the three most productive tight ends over the last decade and what, the percentage of their passes that traveled, under 10 yards in the air. Travis Kelce, that number was 65%. Jimmy Graham, that was 59%. And Rob Gronkowski, that was 48%. And notably, in Gronk's first 5 years, that number was actually 54%. He became much more of a deep threat in the back half of his NFL career than in the front half of his NFL career in terms of his usage as a vertical threat. But I looked up the 17 different instances where a tight end has had 800 or more yards receiving the past 3 years, right? 17 times that has happened. And I looked at what percentage of their throws, of their targets, traveled less than 10 yards. And across that group, that number was 65%. So basically what Travis Kelce's career average. And if you remove Pitts from the data, right, his 2021 season, that's one of those 17 seasons, that number would actually go up to about 67%. So when you do the math, if Pitts basically saw a quote unquote normal amount of underneath targets compared to his usual workload of more of the intermediate and deeper throws that have made up the bulk of his targets over his NFL career, that would result over the last 3 years on average of about 12 more catches per season, assuming that he wasn't getting more targets. Just a higher percentage of those targets that he was getting wound up being short throws. because he would basically get about 35 more targets across 3 years. So that's about an average of, or 35 more catches across those 3 years. And because he would catch a higher number of those, because typically quarterbacks tend to complete a higher percentage of short throws than the vertical stuff. And so, if you were just to add 35 more catches to Pitts' career total over the last 3 years, he ranks currently like 15th with 149 catches across those 3 years. And, those 35 additional catches, basically if Kyle Pitts was used like a normal tight end, he'd be theoretically, again, ranking 7th in total catches across the 3 years with 184. And so for that reason, I think there's every reason to believe that utilizing Kyle Pitts as a more traditional, air quotes, or normal tight end will boost his production. And then when you look at how the Rams under Sean McVay, as well as, Rams McVay derivative offense like Kevin O'Connell's in Minnesota, and you look at their tight ends, you see similar usage in terms of a lot more underneath stuff, right? Hockenson is probably the best example of a high volume pass catching tight end in a McVay derivative offense, because that's not really been something that's been a featured aspect of the McVay offense in LA. And Hockenson over the last 2 years in Minnesota, about 73% of his targets were underneath. So, much higher than the league average and much higher than Kyle Pitts. You look at Tyler Higbee in his 7 years with Sean McVay, that number was 78%. Gerald Everett in his 4 years with Sean McVay was 72%. And then you can even go back to Sean McVay's time in Washington when he had another sort of unicorn of a tight end in Jordan Reed in the 3 years that McVay was calling plays there. Reed's, percentage of targets that were 10 or less than 10 yards in the air were 75%. So, even if you remove Higbee from the data, right, because Higbee's more of a blocking tight end, right, the average of the other three would be about 74% of their targets traveled less than 10 yards in the air. And so you do the type of math, again, that would equal, if Pitts got that same workload over the last 3 years, that would be about 17 more catches on average per year. So as we've discussed before, that deep threat role, if Pitts is not going to be that primary deep threat, that deep threat role has traditionally been the X wide receiver in the Sean McVay Rams offense. That role is expected to be performed by Darnell Mooney this upcoming season. We've mentioned before how, Mooney isn't necessarily the most productive deep ball passer. We'll revisit that topic towards the end of today's episode when we talk about the potential impact on the quarterback on Kyle Pitts' production. But another thing that we can expect to see change in terms of Kyle Pitts' usage in the Zac Robinson offense, in addition to getting more short passes than the deep passes, right, is also being more of that traditional, air quotes, inline tight end. And we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Guys, it is summertime, which means baseball, NBA Finals, NHL, Stanley Cup Finals, all of it's now here for you, and you can bet on it all over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 you can use to bet on everything from the Finals MVP to who's going to hit that ball out of the park. And, you can bet on the NFL upcoming season in terms of a litany of Falcons bets. You can bet on Kirk Cousins' production, Kyle Pitts' production, right? Bijan Robinson's production, how many wins the Falcons are going to have. All that's available in NBA draft coming up, next in 2 weeks or whatever it is. You can bet on that as well. Who the Hawks going to take #1 overall. All you got to do is head on over to FanDuel.com/LockedOn and add a big win to your summer bucket list. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook. And guys, before we continue today's conversation about Kyle Pitts, I want to plug the Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories. Can't miss it, analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. And if you're looking for the local big stories, check out Locked On Sports Atlanta's 24/7 streaming channel here on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So another change in terms of Pitts' usage this year is I think we're going to see more of him as an inline tight end. I've seen a lot of people sort of speculating that Pitts will actually see less as be more of a wide receiver than a true tight end because of their expectation that the Falcons are going to have a high degree of 11 personnel usage, 11 personnel referring to those 3 wide receiver sets that the Rams have made so famous over the years in the McVay offense. And that's going to lead to Pitts being basically a wide receiver in this offense. I don't really agree with that assessment, right? I think all the statements from Zac Robinson and others on this coaching staff, including tight ends coach Kevin Kocher, seem to suggest that they see Pitts more as a quote unquote traditional tight end. And my interpretation of their usage of traditional means inline, right? Where he lines up in a 2-point stance. And, we haven't really seen, a tight end with Pitts' athletic profile in the McVay Rams offense. The closest comparison would be Gerald Everett. And Gerald Everett was a featured weapon in that offense in 2019 and 2020, not nearly as featured as the wide receivers were, but at his peak during those 2019 and 2020 seasons, across those 2 seasons, the Rams actually were 7th in the NFL in those 2 years in 12 personnel, which is the 2 tight end set, with that amounting to about 25% of their plays over that stretch of games. And so I think we're going to see a healthier usage of 12 personnel than a lot of people are assuming. That we'll probably see somewhere between 20 and 25% of the Falcon snaps, and possibly even more, depending on what Charlie Warner and Ross Dwelly and or John Fitzpatrick can do to justify that this upcoming season. But I think that's going to be a significant portion of the Falcons offense. Now, the bulk of the rest of the offense is probably going to be 11 personnel, but I do think people are kind of sleeping on this idea that the Falcons aren't going to utilize a lot of 12 personnel. And I think the big reason why you'll see a healthy dose of 12 personnel is just to get a better blocker in that sort of inline role on the field than Kyle Pitts is, right? We mentioned the other day a quote from Zac Robinson where he said, Kyle Pitts has quote unquote untapped potential as a sort of blocking tight end, inline tight end. I don't quite disagree with that, although I do think Pitts will probably be better in that role this year than he was certainly last year. In 2023, PFF graded Pitts 136 out of 137 tight ends as a run blocker. The only player that graded out worse than Kyle Pitts was Hayden Hurst, by the way, which, hopefully throws cold water on that 4-year-old idea that many a Falcon fan had 4 years ago that Hayden Hurst was going to be this impactful blocker. And it was just like, I remember on this podcast being like, you guys have clearly not been paying any attention to what Hayden Hurst has done in Baltimore, if you think that. But, that hopefully underlines that point. Am I petty over arguments that were happening 4 years ago? No, I'm not petty. I'm too humble to be petty about those arguments. But, I do think Pitts' poor grading, getting back to the subject at hand, Pitts' poor grading as a blocker last year especially was in part due to the knee injury, that playing in that 3-point stance that you would need to be as a blocker is harder to do when you're dealing with the knee injury. It's harder to kind of explode out of your stance in the ways that you did. And that was a big reason why the Falcons went the opposite way in terms of utilizing him as an inline tight end and actually rarely used him in that role basically after the first month of the season. So I do expect Pitts to be a better blocker than he was a year ago, because the expectation is he's going to be healthy this year. But even his best year as a run blocker, according to PFF grades, was his rookie season, and he still was only a 34th percentile run blocker among tight ends that year. So he's probably always going to be a below average run blocker. Now, maybe Zac Robinson's hoping that he can get him, closer to 50 than where he has been in previous years, that 50th percentile, which would be average. But in general, I don't think you want Kyle Pitts blocking at the point of attack, right? And by that we mean that he's, if you're running it to the left, he's going to be lined up on the left and sort of at the point of attack where you're running the football to. Instead, Pitts is better suited, given his blocking concerns, as being more of that sort of backside blocker, where if you're running it to the left, you're going to put Kyle Pitts on the right side of the line. And so therefore, hopefully, theoretically, the play shouldn't rest and fall based off of his ability to hit that block. And so I think we're going to see much more of Charlie Warner and or Ross Dwelly as that sort of blocking tight end on the front side or at the point of attack, however you want to call it. So when we talk about Pitts's normal, air quotes, normal amount of inline tight end usage, now we can compare him to the other top receiving tight ends in the league. And of course, again, we have the 17 player sample over the last 3 years of guys that have had 800 plus yards. And we can look at the percentage on average that those guys spend as inline tight ends. And I need to stress, this is only based off of their pass snaps, not based off of their run blocking snaps. So we're only looking at how often when they're asked to run routes, are they lining up inline, right? And on average, across that 17-player group, about 39% of their pass snaps come as inline tight ends, right? And you look at Pitts' number in that category, it's less than 20%, right? So the average of the top tight end, pass catching tight ends over the last 3 years, basically doubles Kyle Pitts' usage as an inline tight end. Now, last year, as I mentioned before, that number was at its lowest at 14.9%. And again, I think that was due to the knee injury and the Falcons wanting to protect that knee and not put as much stress on it from asking him to line up in a 3-point stance that you typically do as an inline tight end. It's harder to explode out of your stance, not only as a run blocker, but also as a route runner when you have a bum knee. I don't have MCL or PCL injury history, but I do have a 40-year-old body. So I feel like that's similar to coming off of, an MCL or PCL tear, being out of shape at 40 years old. And so like, it is much more stressful on my knees. I can certainly vouch for that. So that's where I'm figuring that also being an issue for Kyle Pitts as well. Now, his rookie year, Kyle Pitts' high in terms of inline snap percentage was about 28%. So the average guy in the NFL, at least the average top pass catcher, still is above what Kyle Pitts at any point in his career. And now if you look at the 3 pass catching tight ends in the McVay offense, and again, we're looking at TJ Hockenson, Gerald Everett, and Jordan Reed in that regard, right? About 48% of their pass snaps saw them line up in line. And that's why I kind of expect Pitts to be somewhere in that 40% range, potentially above that number. Reed was the lowest out of that trio at 42% in the 3 years that he played under Sean McVay in Washington. And so I kind of think that's probably where we'll be expecting Pitts to come in, somewhere, in that average range around 40%, maybe 42, 45%, something around that. And so elsewhere in the NFL, you look at the tight ends over the past 3 years with 800 plus yards and that received under 40% of their targets or their pass snaps lined up in line. That happened 7 times among these 17 tight ends. Pitts was one of those as a rookie. Travis Kelce was 3 of those years. Mark Andrews had 2 of those years, and Evan Ingram had the other one. So clearly it's only a subset of these guys that typically are more slot receivers, I guess you could say, based off of their inline usage compared to other of these tight ends that get a significantly higher percentage of inline snaps. And for a lot of those guys, it was in the 40s, 50s, and 60s in terms of their inline snaps. So I'm expecting these two would be the 2 biggest changes for Kyle Pitts in this offense, that we're going to see a lot more of Kyle Pitts as an underneath pass catcher, which should lead to him getting a higher number of receptions just because it's easier to complete those short passes, as well as Kyle Pitts being more of a quote-unquote traditional inline tight end. Again, it's not going to be the bulk of his snaps, but I think you'll see a healthy percentage that is much more in line with the trends of the rest of the league and what we've seen from past McVay tight ends like Jordan Reed and TJ Hockenson and Gerald Everett. But speaking of, those short intermediate stuff, another big variable that's going to change, we've talked about the reasons why it's going to look different from a play calling standpoint from Zac Robinson. The other big factor is the upgrade at the quarterback, and that should also benefit Kyle Pitts' production this year. And so now we're going to wrap up today's episode getting some more stats at you. I know some of you guys that flunked math or eyes have been glazing over a lot in today's episode, so I apologize in advance that we're going to throw some more numbers at you. But how big an upgrade is the quarterback position? And we'll base that off of, distance of the passes thrown and sort of if Kyle Pitts' newfound role as this quote unquote short route king, is going to jibe well with where Kirk Cousins typically produces. And we'll break that down to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Now, before we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons, I want to tell you what your first listen will be tomorrow, and that should be the first episode of the Falcons Historian Player Shootout, in which we'll have 2 contestants duel head-to-head in a trivia tournament all summer long about one specific Falcons legend from the past 20 years. That first matchup will be all about Devontae Freeman, my cousin, and that will be a matchup featuring Jarvis Davis and Corey Woodruff. And then I believe the second matchup we'll see how it goes, but I think it's going to be Matt Chernoff versus Alan Stirk, who will be co-hosting this series all summer long. Alan Stirk, that is, and so that will be available you probably at the end of the week. So that's the plan. We'll probably get 2 or so of these a week for the next several weeks as we get through, the first couple of rounds. So that is something in store for you, a summer series all summer long. So just want to give you guys a heads up if you didn't miss that announcement that we did, like 3 weeks ago or something, whenever that was. But that was before Memorial Day. That's all I remember. But anyway, let's talk about the quarterback variable with Kyle Pitts on today's episode before we get into all that tomorrow. And, another expectation I think most of us all have is that Kyle Pitts will benefit from improved quarterback play. And, I've argued in the past, before we get into that, I've argued in the past that, discussing Darnell Mooney's lack of production as a deep receiver over the last couple of years in Chicago, a lot of people have pushed back against that notion, saying, hey, that's because he hasn't had a quarterback. I've pushed back against that notion because, to me, the evidence seems to suggest that the quarterback is not the be-all, end-all when it comes to wide receiver production on deep throws in particular. It's not to say that the quarterback doesn't matter. Certainly quarterback play should matter in that, but most of the evidence I've sort of seen suggests that it's not the most important factor, evidenced by the variability within teams, right? When you have the same quarterback, but yet players on the same team have completely different catch rates. Like, for example, Darnell Mooney only caught 25% of his passes, deep passes from Justin Fields last year, compared to DJ Moore, who caught 60%, right? You can look at the Falcons in the past where, Julio and Roddy and Calvin Ridley were much more productive as vertical, route runners than, say, a Russell Gage or Harry Douglas, despite having the commonality of Matt Ryan. And so, again, it's not to sit here and say that quarterback play doesn't matter. It does matter, but the data seems to suggest that, at least when it comes to the deep ball, it's more about the guy catching the ball than it is the guy throwing the ball. Now, I haven't done a deep dive on the data to, support this, but I would imagine probably quarterback play probably matters a little bit more the shorter the passes are, because that variability is a little bit different. And if you have a quarterback that can complete 62% of those passes versus someone who can complete 54% of those passes, I think that is going to be probably a little bit more meaningful in terms of the quarterback play. But it's worthwhile looking at Pitts' production over the years based off of distance thrown, right? Looking at deep, medium, or intermediate passes, right? Deep passes being any throws that travel 20 or more yards in the air. Intermediate or medium passes being those that travel 10 to 19 yards, and then short passes, passes that traveled, beyond the line of scrimmage, but no more than 9 yards in the league. And so, looking at the league averages in terms of the percentage of deep passes that are completed, 38% is the league average across the last 3 years. In 2023, 36% of Kyle Pitts' targets on deep passes were completed, so roughly league average. In 2022, when Marcus Mariota was a quarterback, that number was 7%, so well below league average. And then in Matt Ryan's last year in Atlanta in 2021, Kyle Pitts' first year, that number was 58%, so well above league average. And so, that number, especially in 2022, really was a problem, because that was also the year where the Falcons threw the ball the most to Kyle Pitts down the field, like twice the rate that they did in the previous year, as well as the following year, which was this past year in 23. And so, as we discussed, coming off of the heels of that 2022 season, which was a big reason why we were so optimistic about, what Desmond Ridder could do, not because we thought he was a massive upgrade over Marcus Mariota, but we talked about how Mariota's inability to hit Kyle Pitts on so many of those deep passes, across the 10 games that he played, cost him about 150 yards in those 10 games. If Mariota had just hit those passes at an average number, that would have probably, added up to another 150 yards for Kyle Pitts that season. And then if you assume that Kyle Pitts would have stayed healthy for the entire season, which is not an assumption you should make, then you're talking about potentially 300 up to 300 yards, left on the field just from not having a quarterback that could reliably hit those deep throws, right? And so that's a thing that we're hoping to see from Kirk Cousins. We'll talk a little bit more about where Kirk falls on that spectrum in terms of his deep passing completion percentage. But let's talk about the medium throws, right? The league average is about 57% over the last 3 years. Kyle Pitts, 54% of his medium targets caught in 23, 59% in 2022, 64% in 2021. So once again, Matt Ryan is ahead of the pack here. But given the sample size, you're not dealing with a huge difference, and it's a handful of catches, right? And for Desmond Ridder, who was below average in that era, or at least the combination of Desmond Ridder and Taylor Heineke, let's be fair, that was below average. That's only amounting to about one less catch than Kyle Pitts is, quote unquote, supposed to get if he's getting league average quarterback play. And Matt Ryan, despite having above average 64% compared to the league average of 57%, that's only amounting to about 4 more catches for, in 21 than the league average quarterback is given. So not moving the needle in a whole different way. The short passing, right, 0 to 9 yards, the league average is about 77%. Last year, They completed about 80% of those throws to Kyle Pitts. The previous year was 71%. And then this is where the one area where Matt Ryan was lacking in this regard was 60% in 2021. And now Matt Ryan did, as a collective, complete 77% of his passes on short passes that year. So league average in that regard. But obviously that connection with him and Kyle Pitts on the short throws wasn't as strong as it was with other receivers on the team. So let's talk about where Kirk stacks up in these numbers. Kirk's deep passing over the last 5 years, his completion percentage on deep throws is 44%. Again, the league average is 38%. His completion percentage on intermediate throws is 65%. Again, the league average is 57%. And his completion rate on short throws is 81%. League average, again, 77%. So Kirk is above average in all three areas. And so that's why you're hopeful that, hey, we'll get even better quarterback play than we've gotten Kyle Pitts, at least to date in his NFL career. And what's interesting about Kirk's numbers, looking them up, is like, he's trending up as a deep in terms of his efficiency as a deep ball passer, but trending down in terms of his efficiency as an intermediate passer, right? In 2019, his deep ball completion percentage was 39%. That has, climbed up to 48% in this most recent season, his last year in Minnesota. And in 2019, his medium passing was 75%, which is well above the 57% league average. But this past year, it was close to the league average, which was 59%. So I do think there's growth potential for Kyle Pitts in all three of these areas, but it is notable to me that, Kirk is not necessarily consistently hitting these numbers, and in certain areas is kind of trending up and trending down. So we'll see if that continues here in Atlanta, or we can sort of reset the clock there. But I do think the deep ball and the short stuff is where the most growth potential is based off of Kirk's numbers compared to the league average, right? That, it will probably result, him completing 65 versus 57% probably is going to only result in a handful more completions on the short, or on the intermediate or medium pass level. But, it's still probably only going to be a handful of passes on the deep passes. But because those plays typically average like 30 yards per catch, if you do catch them, a handful of big plays of those deep passes can make a significant difference, especially given how lacking in the explosiveness the Falcons offense have been over the last 3 years. And so even if you're not throwing to Pitts as often deep, if you're hitting a higher percentage of those, that can be very valuable for the team. But again, I think the short passes is really where the most growth potential is. We're expecting to see Kyle Pitts get significantly more targets there than he has historically. Again, he's only caught 69% of his career passes on those short throws. The league average is about 77%. Kirk is about 81%. So again, you're talking about if he can get the average number underneath targets relative to other tight ends and going from 45% to somewhere in that 65 to 75% range potentially on those targets that are traveling less than 10 yards in the air. And now you have a quarterback that's going to complete potentially 80% or more of those throws to you. In theory, that's going to be a huge boost for Kyle Pitts' production. So that's where we're sort of falling on why we're optimistic and hopeful about what Kyle Pitts will be able to do in this Zac Robinson-led offense with improved quarterback play for Kirk Cousins. Some of these numbers tend to suggest that, the quarterback play, at least last year, was not nearly as detrimental to Kyle Pitts. Like, if the narrative for Kyle Pitts, basically what the numbers are telling us, right, is healthy and had a good quarterback his rookie season. So you saw the best of Kyle Pitts. The big drop the following year was the quarterback play, and then he got hurt in the second half of the season. And then last year, it was less about the quarterback play and more about the coming off the injury, I think, is really what the numbers are strongly suggesting. And really the quarterback play in 2022 was only really bad on the deep stuff. Again, Mario was fine in the other areas, relatively speaking, to the rest of the league. But we'll see how that benefits Kyle Pitts. We'll, probably talk about the red zone stuff. We didn't really get into that on today's episode, but I kind of want to wait and explore that once I get a little bit more access to all 22 of the Rams and Vikings red zone offenses, seeing if, Zac Robinson going to steal some things from Kevin O'Connell or Sean McVay in terms of how he'll utilize Kyle Pitts and other weapons in this offense this upcoming season. That's something that we can explore further later in the summer. But, so it's not the last time that we'll talk about Kyle Pitts and what's in store for him in 2024 on this podcast, but it's the end of today's episode in terms of talking about Kyle Pitts and what's in store for him in 2024. And so if you want to continue to get that information, make sure you subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Tune in tomorrow for episode 1 of the Falcons Historian Player and Shootout. talking about Devontae Freeman. And of course, you can check out all the great shows on the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.